The map you can't see is controlling the world. The moment the ocean went dark, the money moved first. Trading screens lagged from Mumbai to Milan. Bank servers rerouted, then failed. For 6 hours, a third of the world's internet traffic crawled. Ships drifted in lanes they suddenly couldn't see. In a control room in Cairo, a technician stared at a bathymetry overlay going black, live feeds replaced with static. 3 cables, then 5. A tugboat's anchor was the official story. But in the operations chat, someone typed what nobody wanted to say out loud. They had the map. The real one, the one that tells you where to cut, where to hide, and how to make the ocean go quiet. The map you can't see. To understand why a tugboat can accidentally hit the same corridor twice, we need to go back to a stranger truth. We've mapped Mars better than our own seafloor. The public map, the one you can download, the one textbooks show, is a sketch from space, inferred from tiny ripples on the ocean's surface. Useful, pretty, wrong in the ways that matter when steel meets rock at 4,000 meters. Other map lives behind clearances and compartmented servers. It isn't a single file or a neat atlas. It's a mosaic, military surveys from the Cold War stitched to all company seismic lines, recent swathes from autonomous ships, and classified lanes cut through the noise by submarines that never officially existed. It's detailed down to the crease of a submarine-sized canyon and the cold seep a drilling rig wants to avoid. It's updated faster in some places than Google updates your street. Here's the human part. 30 years ago, a young hydrographer on a research vessel in the North Pacific named Elena watched her boss quietly save a duplicate of every night's high-resolution line, not to the expedition archive, to a separate encrypted drive. Contractual obligations, he said, smiling without humor. Weeks later, after a bland wrap-up report was filed, a private cable consortium wired their payment. Elena asked who sent them the coordinates for the safe trench to thread their fiber through. Her boss shrugged. Everyone pays for certainty. That word certainty is the heart of the map you can't see. For a submarine commander, certainty is knowing a seamount doesn't rise 20 meters higher than the public grid suggests. For a cable-laying captain, it's a route that won't soar $1 billion line against a basalt tooth in a winter storm. For a mining startup eyeing the Clarion-Clipperton zone, certainty is a patchwork of geophysical scans that tell them where the nodules pile up and where regulators are watching. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the shadows. Navies realized that bathymetry is a weapon, not just to avoid detection, but to shape it. You don't just hide in the deepest water, you hide where temperature layers bend sound around you. Those layers, those contours, live on charts with caveats the public never sees. What nobody knew at the time, outside a few rooms, was how quickly autonomous platforms would accelerate the mapping race. Small, quiet surface drones began drawing LiDAR-tight lines across seas once too expensive to grid. Underwater vehicles crawled continental slopes, filling the gaps. Now remember, the ocean isn't just floor and water, it's infrastructure. Over 99% of international data rides through glass strands laid on that floor. Those strands converge into choke points, narrows where geography dictates a bundle of cables must pass. The public map shows approximate routes. The real map shows exact burial depths, hard-bottom detours, the few safe corridors where an anchor can't reach. If you have that, you can make a region blink without leaving a fingerprint. If you don't, you're playing roulette with $1 trillion economy. Get this, they actually thought for a while that obscurity was enough protection. Don't publish precise lines and you're safe. But fishermen figured out where their nets snagged. Survey ships with innocent names loitered. And across town, in a defense lab, engineers were fusing satellite AIS tracks, old seismic surveys, and scraps from environmental impact statements into something close to the mosaic the navies guarded. The decision to keep the real charts compartmented would matter because it created a market. If you wanted certainty, you went private or you went covert. Here's where it gets tricky. The International Seabed Authority regulates mining in the high seas, but the best bathymetry often sits outside their files. Oil majors hold terabytes of detail, defense ministries hold more. China's research fleet, equipped with deep-diving submersibles and a growing web of sensors, gathers its own. The US Navy, Russians, Europeans, each feeds a separate puzzle. Nobody shares the full picture, but each acts like they do. Micro story: in the Red Sea, a cable repair skipper named Karim drank his coffee cold because the ROV feed wouldn't load fast enough. He'd been sent to a probable break, marked by a rectangle on a public chart. 2 days wasted. Then a private contractor arrived, handed over a single set of coordinates with 6 decimal places. Karim lowered the grapnel once. The line came up cut clean. He didn't ask how they knew. He just watched the lights in his cabin stop flickering when the splice took. But there was one problem. The same precision that protects cables also protects submarines. There are gullies where a boat's magnetic and acoustic shadows vanish into geological noise. Navies call them sanctuaries, though nobody says it out loud. If your opponent knows those sanctuaries, your deterrent isn't as invisible as you think. That's why, when new detection tech, quantum magnetometers, AI-fused sensor webs, promised to peel back some of that cover, the mapping race intensified. You can't outsmart physics without knowing exactly where it changes. 3 days earlier than the blackout we opened on, a Chinese survey ship ran a tight grid near a contested island chain. Officially, it studied fish habitats. Unofficially, the swath matched an older all-company block. Across the horizon, a US oceanographic vessel traced a perpendicular pattern. Unknown to them, a European telecom rep sat in a hotel, refreshing an encrypted portal, waiting for the bid window to open on a new cable route. Everyone was drawing lines on the same seafloor, for different reasons, pretending the lines didn't intersect. Here's the crazy part: the public might benefit from the best of this. Safer shipping, better storm models, but the incentives keep the sharpest details locked up. So the ocean remains mapped at 1 kilometer resolution for the crowd, and at 1 meter, sometimes 10 centimeters, for those who can buy, steal, or classify certainty. This was the moment everything changed for Alina. Years after that first voyage, she took a job with an NGO pushing open ocean data. She thought she'd help. Instead, she learned what doors wouldn't open. She kept a list of refused requests. It read like a map of global anxiety: Arctic passages, southern cable junctions, trench heads near ballistic missile sub-patrol routes. When the ocean went dark, it wasn't just a glitch. It was a demonstration. Somewhere, someone used a better map, and everyone who had one knew exactly what that meant. The first quiet war, Cold War bathymetry. To understand the blackout, you have to hear the ocean the way the Cold War did, through steel hulls and headphones, through maps that weren't maps yet. After World War II, submarines stopped being hunters and became insurance policies. Second strike, invisible cities carrying weapons you never use unless the world ends. That turned every seafloor ridge into strategy. The quiet war wasn't waged with missiles, it was waged with contours. Get this, the earliest lines came from mistakes. A US attack boat clipped an uncharted rise in the North Atlantic in the 1950s and limped home, hull scraped, pride worse. The debrief didn't ask who to blame. It asked where the rise came from. That question funded decades of oceanographic cruises with classified compartments, icebreakers that measured more than ice, and hydrographic offices that learned to smile blankly when asked for data. Meanwhile, something else was happening on land. In a windowless building in Maryland, analysts built the first ocean sound channels on paper, layering temperature, salinity, and depth to show where sound curved. Where it curved mattered more than depth itself. A ridge could shield or amplify, a trench could swallow a propeller's note. The maps got stranger. Not just elevation, but acoustic shadows, where a Soviet boat might be heard in winter, but disappear in summer when the thermocline dropped. This was the moment everything changed for Soviet captains too. They switched patrol routes when their boats' noise fell, hugging continental slopes where seafloor clutter confused Western sonars. In the Barents and the Kurils, they found gullies that ate echoes. Western navies noticed by absence. Gaps opened in the hydrophone nets. SOSUS lines that could paint the Atlantic like a radar screen went fuzzy along certain scarps. The answer wasn't more hydrophones, it was better bathymetry. Micro story: a British frigate sonar officer named Pat kept a corkboard of ghost lanes, bearings where contacts repeatedly vanished. He pinned them with red string across a North Atlantic chart. Years later, he saw a classified bathymetric overlay and laughed out loud. The string traced a drowned river valley carved when sea level was lower. The valley bent sound like a funhouse mirror. The ghosts were real, the map had been wrong. To fix that, navies did something sneaky. They turned submarine missions into survey missions. You'd transit under EMCON and while avoiding being heard, ping just enough, low power, coded pulses, and collect bottom returns for internal use. Oil companies did their part without meaning to. Seismic lines for offshore drilling revealed buried channels and hard patches. The data crossed oceans in brown envelopes, then in encrypted reels. Meanwhile, oceanographic pioneers, Hess, Heesen, Tharp, published mid-ocean ridge maps that electrified geology but left out the resolutions warfighters craved. What nobody outside the circle knew at the time, the Cold War's most infamous undersea gambit, Operation Ivy Bells, depended on bathymetry. The US found a calm, deep bend in a Soviet undersea cable route in the Sea of Okhotsk, a spot where the line lay quiet and accessible. You don't put a tapping pod on a cable unless you know the bottom won't roll it, unless you can hide the approach in a sand wave field that masks a sub's wake. That's bathymetry as tradecraft. The arms race pushed both sides to map the Arctic like a city. Under-ice navigation forced accuracy down to meters. A misread hummock could take off a sail. A misjudged keel could trap a boat beneath a pressure ridge. US boats ran the Transpolar Express, carrying inertial navigation drift corrected by secret under-ice features only a handful of pilots knew. Soviet charts, scarcer but fierce, marked polinyas and leads. The seafloor below mattered as much as the ice above. Sound channeling in the Arctic flipped with seasons, and only a layered map told you when to sprint, when to drift. But there was one problem. Every chart was stitched from fragments. The Atlantic had exquisite slices where boats transited often and blank cloth elsewhere. The Pacific had exquisite swathes near Guam and Pearl Harbor, then fuzz that hid seamounts like teeth. Collisions, those you hear rumors about, kept the stitching going. A scrape here led to a new survey line there. A sonar anomaly near the GIUK gap turned into a month-long mapping drag by research trawlers. While that was happening in New York, insurance actuaries priced shipping routes. They didn't know they were reading a lagging indicator of secrecy. Premiums dipped where navies had quietly mapped and rose where nobody had. And across town, in a sleepy telecom office, engineers laid out early Atlantic cables along gentle slopes with suspicious precision. Fishermen swore they'd been told were not to trawl by men who never gave names. Patience defined the era. You didn't need the whole ocean, just corridors, boomers patrol boxes, choke points like the GIUK gap, the Greenland side canyons where SSD gradients bent sound like glass. Those corridors became property without deeds. If your maps were better, your submarines were safer, your sonars were smarter, and your taps stayed undetected longer. In the aftermath of the Cold War, pieces leaked. Declassified charts with coarse grids, academic bathymetry with holes that aligned a little too neatly with patrol law. Elena, now older, found a photocopied strip chart from a 1970s cruise in a university archive, inked ridges, scribbled depths, a penciled note, good cover in SW wind. It read like a whisper from that first quiet war. Here's the thing, the Cold War didn't end the mapping race, it normalized it. It taught institutions to invest in uncertainty reduction, to treat seabed knowledge as deterrence, and to hide the best parts behind bland words, safety, navigation, research. Those habits survived. When the ocean went dark decades later, the fingerprints on the blackout were old, made of lines first drawn when maps were weapons and silence was strategy. Cables, canyons, and the billion-dollar guess. Karam Splice fixed the lights, but it didn't fix the business model. Laying a cable is like threading a glass hair through a moving mountain range, then betting a continent's traffic that the mountain won't shift. You don't lay once, you lay with a plan for a decade of storms, trawlers, earthquakes, and politics. Every detour is money. Every mistake is headlines. The wrong map turns into fees, outages, and sometimes a currency wobble you can't explain at a press conference. Here's what nobody outside the rooms likes to admit. The approximate route on public charts is theater. The real line snakes to avoid hard rock, sand waves, and submarine landslides with names only geologists use. In the Bay of Biscay, sand waves march like slow herds. If you cross them wrong, the bed forms migrate and lift your cable like a clothesline. In the Mediterranean, canyon heads eat anything loose. One winter, a whole segment went missing. The ROV found it draped over a lip like a ribbon. Insurance paid. The shareholders asked about climate resilience. The engineers quietly plotted a new route that hugged a chalky ledge nobody discussed on stage. Micro-story, May, a route engineer in Singapore, kept a photo of a coral knuckle on her desk. Not a pretty reef, an ugly, dense knob she'd seen at 900 meters on an inspection camera, the thing that nearly sawed her first project in half. She, argued for a 2-kilometer detour, was overruled, and watched 2 years later as a swell event and a trawler pass shaved the sheath down to copper. When the alarm came, she drove back to the office at midnight and pulled up a set of maps labeled training. They weren't training, they were a partner's private bathymetry. The detour would have cleared the knuckle by 50 meters. She remembered the meeting faces, then the near miss, and promised herself, never sell certainty short to save a slide. Meanwhile, something else was happening upstream. Tech giants stopped renting space on other people's cables and started building their own. They wanted latency control, redundancy, leverage. They hired the same route engineers, but they added another layer, data sovereignty. A line that skirts a territorial sea for legal reasons might run smack into a canyon head for physical reasons. The compromise is a zigzag nobody sees unless they have the good charts. What nobody knew at the time, watching glossy launch videos of new transoceanic projects, was how crude some bids really were. Contractors pitched with 1-kilometer grids, then scrambled after award to buy, beg, or broker high-resolution swathes from oil majors and national hydrographic offices. The price spread didn't show line item certainty, but it was in there: 6 figures for a single corridor cutout, 7 for a basin if the seller smelled urgency. If you balked, you guessed. And guessing is what makes billion-dollar projects sweat. While that was happening in New York boardrooms out at sea, canyons wrote their own rules. Submarine canyons funnel turbidity currents, underwater avalanches that can run for hundreds of kilometers. The 1929 Grand Banks event snapped dozens of telegraph cables in sequence, each break time-stamped as the mud wave raced downslope. Modern planners pretend the past is past. Then a 1-in-200-year storm hits, and a canyon wakes up. If your route clips the margin, you learn the hard way that gravity still does procurement. But there was one problem. Avoiding nature doesn't avoid people. Fishing fleets drag heavy gear. Anchors drop where pilots misjudge. States test deniability with accidental strikes near choke points. The Red Sea cluster that dimmed screens from Cairo to Karachi didn't just happen in a busy lane. It happened where geology squeezes routes into a bundle. The public map said congested area. The real map said 1 safe burial pocket, 3 risky shelves, do not cross this scarp. Someone crossed it. On purpose or not, they had the pocket circled. Karim heard the politics later on the radio and shook his head. He knew the feeling of a clean cut. It wasn't heave, it wasn't abrasion, it was decisive. May, watching from Singapore, sketched the corridor on scrap paper and wrote 2 words, target knowledge. Elena, now at the NGO, logged 6 DENI data requests for that same stretch over 5 years. Different agencies, same answer, sensitive. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The very maps that make cables safer make them easier to hurt. That's why route files live on air-gap drives and couriers still carry hard disks. That's why clauses in contracts read like spy novels. And yet, the ocean keeps shifting, and the pressure to share for safety keeps rising. Each outage is an argument for openness. Each accident is an argument for silence. The psychology is a trap. Safety needs trust. Trust demands exposure. Exposure invites risk. In the aftermath of the blackout, bids paused. Insurance premiums ticked up. A consortium quietly greenlit a parallel line with extra burial in the narrowest notch, spending tens of millions to buy bathymetry they'd pretended they didn't need. It wasn't just risk management. It was an acknowledgement. Out here, certainty isn't a luxury. It's the difference between a world that hums and a world that goes quiet. Satellites that see the seafloor. To make sense of a world run on hidden charts, we've got to talk about the map everyone thinks we have, the satellite one. From orbit, satellites don't actually see the bottom, they see the ocean's surface bulge. A buried ridge adds mass, gravity tugs the water a millimeter higher, and altimeters read that swell like braille from space. It's elegant. It's also why the public map looks smooth where reality is sharp. Here's where it gets interesting. In 2014, a new generation of radar altimeters started stitching the first global update in years, resolving features tens of kilometers across that had never been charted. Headlines cheered, seamounts discovered. Route engineers and submarine captains didn't cheer. They already knew the ocean's big bones. They needed teeth, ledges, and the little cuts that bend sound. The satellite map told them where to look. It didn't tell them how not to die. Meanwhile, something else was happening. The altimetry data woke up a hunt for the missing plane in the Indian Ocean. Search planners combined satellite swells with shipborne multi-beam surveys, turning a gray patch into a labyrinth of ridges and valleys. Families waited while lines were drawn, redrawn, erased. The public watched altimetry become human. And in the background, navies took notes. The space map could accelerate triage. You could target your high-resolution passes. You could hide your best corridors in the noise that remained. Microstory: a junior analyst in Perth named Amina spent nights subtracting tidal models from satellite measurements, chasing a whisper of extra mass near a fracture zone. Her boss told her it wouldn't matter. A month later, a survey ship found a steep-sided knoll almost exactly where her residuals said it might be. The ship's lead emailed one word: nice. Amina printed the image and pinned it beside her screen. It wasn't the knoll that mattered. It was learning where the space map lied, and feeling the rush of being right in a room that doubted. The satellite revolution didn't stop at swells. Commercial constellations started tracking ship AIS footprints like ant trails. You could see where research vessels ran tight, suspicious grids. Stack those tracks over the course bathymetry and you got intent. A line of rectangles along a continental slope meant multi-beam. A pinwheel pattern off an island's shelf meant AUV launches. If you watched long enough, you could infer who was upgrading which slice of the secret map. Yet this space also made secrecy harder. A hydrographic cruise that once looked innocent now glows on open dashboards. Citizens watch, post threads, guess. Companies counter with dark modes, AIS off, transponders faulty, cover stories about fish. But there was one problem: the ocean's a mirror. Satellites with synthetic aperture radar can spot a ship's wake through clouds. You can turn off your beacon, you can't turn off physics. And once the crowd learns the pattern, mystery turns into a timeline. Meanwhile, altimetry fed a public campaign called Seabed 2030, mapped the whole seafloor at respectable resolution by the end of the decade. Elena signed the pledge. She believed in it. She also knew the fine print: respect national security and commercial sensitivity. The gaps on the public grid would close in big blue swathes and then stop right where the old anxieties lived: Arctic margins, choke points, patrol boxes, openness with curated holes. Here's the crazy part. The satellite map made submarines more cautious and more aggressive at the same time. Cautious because fewer unknowns remain at large scale. The days of wandering blind across an unmapped basin are ending. Aggressive because commanders can push deeper into complex terrain, trusting that the broad picture is right and the fine picture, on a drive under lock, will keep them safe. The line between public and private maps becomes a tactic: drift in the public, sprint in the private. Microstory: off Okinawa, a US oceanographic ship logged innocuous altimetry validation passes by day. At night, a small uncrewed surface vessel left its stern, running a lawnmower pattern too tight for cover. The satellite saw the mothership. It didn't see the child. Weeks later, an oil major's tender advertised updated regional bathymetry to approved clients. Elena recognized the swath shape. The ocean keeps secrets, the invoices don't. What nobody knew at the time was how much AI would squeeze from the space data. Models learned to blend gravity fields, currents, and ship tracks, predicting where high-relief microtopography should exist. It wasn't truth, but it was a map to treasure. Send your AUVs there, not there. Lay your cable here, not here. Hunt in this canyon, hide in that one. Certainty by probability, until you buy certainty by meter. In the aftermath of the blackout, satellite analysts rewound weeks of imagery over the Red Sea, looking for track anomalies near the narrowest corridor. They found patterns: pauses by innocuous holes at odd hours, wakes angling across the bundle's suspected course. Enough to suspect, not enough to prove. Space had given the world a sketch. The cut had been made with a scalpel, and the scalpel's edge still lives off the map you can't see. Multi-beam, writing in millimeters. The secret map gets its sharpness from a machine that paints the bottom with sound. Multi-beam isn't one beam, it's a fan, hundreds of narrow pings spread like a peacock tail, each one measuring a tiny patch of seafloor. The ship moves, the tail sweeps, and a swath of depth points fills in. Do that for days, correct for roll, pitch, yaw, speed of sound in water, tides, and instrument drift. And you're not guessing anymore. You're carving the ocean into millimeters. Here's where it gets real. A multi-beam system is only as honest as the water above it. Sound bends with temperature and salinity, so crews drop probes, CTDs, down the column, sampling layers so the software can unwarp the rays. Get that wrong and cliffs tilt, channels shift, and the safest corridor becomes a trap. The best teams run a ritual, probe, ping, check, repeat. It looks boring until you realize what's riding on it. Micro story: on a gray morning north of Guam, a technician named Rafi sat barefoot on the aft deck, cradling a conductivity probe that kept failing at 800 meters. The captain wanted to keep the line running. Weather was closing. Rafi insisted on one more cast. The new profile showed a sharp thermocline dip they'd missed. He pushed the update, and the canyon wall in their model straightened by 2 degrees. It moved a ledge 5 meters outward, the difference between a safe cable bench and a knife edge. When the storm hit, they had 1 more hour of data than they deserved. That hour made the route. Meanwhile, something else was happening under the hull. The seafloor isn't a flat reflector. It scatters sound differently depending on what it's made of. Multibeam records both depth and backscatter, how bright or dull the echo is at different angles. Clay smears the return, rock flashes. With enough passes, you build not just a shape, but a texture map. Soft mud here, gravel there, bedrock ribs you must avoid. Route engineers pay for that texture. Submarines live by it. Get this, modern systems paint so densely that an AUV can fly 10 meters above the bottom and still resolve ripples in sand waves. An uncrewed surface vessel running slow can write a corridor at 10-centimeter resolution. At that scale, you see the small gullies that swallow an anchor, the nodule fields that tempt a miner, the scours behind boulders where a submarine can tuck in and bleed awake. The ocean stops being deep and starts being detailed. But there was one problem. Precision breeds patterns, and patterns expose intent. You can tell a cable corridor survey from a science cruise by the spacing of lines, tight, parallel, slightly overlapping, with calibration patch tests at cardinal headings. You can tell a military swath by what's missing: no AIS, irregular pauses, swathes that end before landfall to hide the approach. Analysts watch those patterns like birders. The birds don't know they're being watched. Micro story: May once flew to a small island to babysit a multi-beam patch test for a partner who couldn't afford a second day on station. She stood on the bow as the ship ran north, east, south, west over the same rock, checking alignment, timing, and beam angle. The mate rolled his eyes. "It's a rock," May smiled. "It's every rock after this." Back in Singapore, she overlaid the patch-corrected corridor on a public grid and felt the usual jolt, as if a fog had burned off, revealing a staircase where the public map claimed a slope. Somewhere, she knew, a submarine skipper had a similar file with a different logo. What nobody outside the circle knew at the time: computer vision learned to clean multibeam like a studio cleans audio. AI filters strip out fish schools, bubble curtains, and ship hiccups, leaving crisp edges. The same networks infer gaps when a storm cuts a line short, predicting the ridge's continuation from its grain. It's not magic, but it's close enough to tempt a planner to skip that last day on station. That's when the veterans push back. No. We write in millimeters because humans trust millimeters. Trust is a feeling before it's a metric. Meanwhile, uncrewed fleets change the economics. A single mothership can field a half-dozen USVs to sweep in parallel, night and day, burning diesel by the sip, not the barrel. China seeds research areas with autonomous survey craft. European firms tow medium arrays behind drone catamarans. The US pairs small USVs with deep AUVs that crawl shelves in silence. You can map more, faster, cheaper, if you accept the security risk of extra radios and links. Most don't. They log locally, encrypt, and dump to a hard drive that moves by hand. Here's the crazy part. Multibeam also tells you what not to believe. False seamounts show up in satellite gravity fields, a swath passes and finds a flat plane. Phantom canyons vanish. Old charts sprout warning notes in margins. Legacy feature unconfirmed. Elena keeps a folder of before and after images, public blue with a smooth hump, private gray with crisp nothing. She shows them to policymakers who think a kilometer grid is good enough. Then she closes the folder when the questions get too pointed. But there was one more problem. Millimeters don't stay millimeters. Earthquakes lift shelves by centimeters, landslides redraw ledges, storm-driven currents migrate bed forms. The map ages. The only honest answer is maintenance, rerun, recheck, refresh. That's expensive. So certainty decays unevenly. The rich lanes, cable bundles, patrol boxes, drilling leases get sharpened every year. The rest blurs. Microstory, Raffi returned to that Guam canyon 3 years later on a different ship. Same corridor, same rock. The ledge he'd saved with a CTD had slumped by half a meter. Not enough to alarm the public. Enough to change a submarine's clearance. He made a note in a logbook nobody would read outside the room, exported a new surface, and passed a drive to a courier in port. 2 weeks later, a patrol's route shifted by a mile. No press release. Just one more quiet line, written in millimeters, holding a world together. The Pacific chessboard. While multibeam carved corridors into millimeters, the Pacific turned into a board where every square held a secret. Not just islands and EEZs, but trenches with names that never make the news, shelves where cables bunch, and volcanic knuckles that can end a patrol or a project. Out here, the pieces are ships with bland names, AUVs that never ping publicly, and submarines that only exist after they retire. The game isn't to announce a move. It's to make one that nobody can prove. 3 days after Karam's splice, Elena flew to Honolulu for a workshop on ocean safety. The agenda looked harmless: shipping, tsunamis, fisheries. The hallway conversations weren't. A Japanese hydrographer muttered about dense grids near the Rukius. An American oceanographer had fresh suntan lines and wouldn't say where he'd been. A Pacific Island regulator showed photos of a new pier and asked quietly if survey exemptions meant what she feared. Everyone spoke in code. Everyone meant bathymetry. Meanwhile, something else was happening far west. China's deep-diving fleet kept busy, chalking up scientific milestones while their survey ships traced tight rectangles along slopes that flanked disputed shoals. On paper, the work catalogued habitats. On deck, AUVs came back with drives full of high-resolution seafloor. The Fenduge had already proven depth wasn't a barrier for them. Depth wasn't even the point. Detail was. With enough detail, a PLA Navy planner could plot a submarine sanctuary behind a ridge, a tapping route along a buried cable span, or a minefield that hugged a hard-bottom boundary no public chart marked. Microstory, a cable planner named Tui in Suva stared at 3 proposed routes to link her island to 2 neighbors. The cheapest line crossed a knobbly margin the public grid smoothed into a blur. The premium option detoured 20 kilometers to thread a bench. The salesman couldn't show the proof, commercial sensitivity, but he offered a warranty that spoke louder than maps. Tui called Elena to ask if that bench likely existed. Elena said yes, then hung up and wrote who mapped that first. On a sticky note, she didn't have to write the second line, who else has it? Get this, across the Philippine Sea, US and allied navies layered their own mosaics. Patrol boxes for boomers need precise entry and exit ramps, gullies where a hull's magnetic signature blends with basalt, temperature layers that bend sound away from hydrophone nets, benches where you can go quiet and not drift into a cliff. Those ramps are taught, not published. A skipper learns them like a city cabbie learns shortcuts. The city keeps changing, the shortcuts don't. Unless someone else maps them too. What nobody outside those rooms knew at the time, the Pacific's densest secret maps sit near the exact places where undersea cables want to run. Geography squeezes both missions, silent deterrence and broadband, to the same notches. The Luzon Strait isn't just a gate between seas, it's a labyrinth of ridges and channels with thermoclines that flip with seasons. There are only so many safe benches. Route engineers covet them. Submarine commanders memorize them. An adversary with the same chart turns benches into bullseyes. Meanwhile, in Canberra, a small task force stitched together open AIS tracks, commercial satellite radar, and public bathymetry to estimate where Chinese survey patterns overlapped with sensitive corridors. The map they printed was mostly guesswork, with polite browns and blues. In the classified annex, the overlay sharpened. Rectangles aligned with suspected cable cuts and research drifts skirted suspected patrol approaches. It still wasn't proof. It was a strong hint that the chessboard had fewer empty squares than anyone admitted. Microstory, on a dawn transit between Guam and Okinawa, a US destroyer's helicopter crew spotted a low, gray USV with a stubby mast running a tight lawnmower pattern. No AIS, no call sign, the sea was glass. The pilot radioed it in. The ship logged unknown survey activity. 2 months later, a European oil major circulated updated hazard layers for the same patch. May received the file under NDA. The swath matched the helicopter's memory like a footprint. But there was one problem. The Pacific isn't just the first island chain and blue water gaps. It's the Arctic's future spillway, where melt opens routes along Siberia and Alaska. The maps there are even more political. Russia treats the Northern Sea route like a toll road. The US calls it international. Beneath the ice, ridges and shelf breaks matter like highways. China's drilling ships practice in scientific programs near the pole, learning how to plant heavy gear on soft bottoms and retrieve it under pressure ridges. Strategic bathymetry will decide who claims safe passage, who gets first dibs on buried gas hydrates, who can park a listening array without it being found by a patrol that only has the public grid. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Pacific Island states want resilience, cables that don't fail, maps that prevent groundings, warnings when turbidity flows threaten lines. They also sit on top of sanctuaries for submarines and alleys for covert operations. When they ask for open bathymetry, defenses bristle. When they accept private surveys, they accept whose eyes get to see the micrometer truth. Elena stood on a dock in Apia, listening to a mayor ask why a safety survey required a month of AIS silence. She didn't have a clean answer. Meanwhile, tech giants cut routes that avoid territorial seas and still hit the shortest path, threading benches nobody can acknowledge. They buy certainty from whoever has it, then bury the line deeper in the tightest notch. Planners whisper about Red Sea lessons while circling Pacific choke points on internal slides. The room nods. The contract clauses grow teeth. The chessboard gets denser. In the aftermath of another unexplained slowdown near Taiwan, blamed on weather, dismissed in press briefings, Karim's cousin, now crewing a repair barge in Kaohsiung, texted him a photo. A seabed scar where a grapnel had dragged, then stopped precisely where a high-rise corridor bent around a knuckle. Someone knew the bend, he wrote. Karim stared at the pixels and felt the same cold certainty he'd felt in Cairo. Somewhere someone had the real map and used it like a move you don't announce, only record after the game. Lines on water, claims on rock. From Honolulu's hallway whispers to hard boundaries, the fight over the secret map bleeds into law. On paper, the ocean looks tidy, straight lines radiating 200 nautical miles from coasts, exclusive economic zones or EEZs. But the seafloor under those lines isn't tidy. It rises in ridges, dips into trenches, and sprouts rock outcrops that can turn water into sovereignty if you can prove they're natural prolongations of your continental shelf. That proof rides on bathymetry, and whoever holds the sharpest version writes the first draft of the claim. Get this, UNCLOS gives countries a chance to push beyond 200 nautical miles if they can show their shelf keeps going. How do you show that? Multi-beam swathes, seismic lines, gravity models, the same tools cable planners buy and navies classify. Submissions to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf read like legal thrillers with contour plots. A line here adds millions of square kilometers of subsurface rights. A line there blocks a rival. The courtroom is diplomatic, but the evidence is geophysical. Microstory, a Norwegian geoscientist named Liv stood before a panel in New York with a map of the Arctic that looked like a gray quilt. She pointed to a subtle rise, the Lomonosov Ridge, and argued continuity. The panel nodded, asked for more data, and sent her home to fetch millimeters from a place where ice tries to crush ships. She flew back with a hard drive wrapped like a relic. The questions weren't about whales or scenery. They were about slopes and foot-of-slope breaks, bathymetric terms that unlock hydrocarbons. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the Pacific. A reef that barely kisses the air at low tide becomes a chess piece. If it's rock, it gets fewer rights. If it's an island, it projects an EEZ. The distinction sounds quaint until you overlay cable routes, suspected patrol corridors, and potential mining blocks. Suddenly, a ring of concrete on a shoal isn't just a construction project, it's a pin in a bathymetric argument. The structure will be attributed to politics. The map underneath decides whether the argument sticks. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The International Seabed Authority governs mining outside national zones, but the sharpest maps of its richest tracts, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, for instance, sit in corporate vaults and defense archives. Applicants show enough to win exploration contracts, then hide the rest to keep advantage. Environmental scientists ask for open data to assess harm. The answer is proprietary more often than precaution. Elena sits in those meetings and hears both sides. Economies want nickel, ecosystems want time, navies want silence. What nobody in public hears at the press conference is how much the cable map shapes claims by stealth. A state that quietly buys high-resolution corridors near a disputed shelf edge gains more than safe routes. It gains confidence to file a bolder boundary. If you know the scarp is here, not there, you draw your natural prolongation line with a surer hand. If your rival only has the kilometer grid, their lawyers hedge. Insufficient data, they write. Data becomes territory without guns. Micro-story, in a South Pacific capital, Tui, the planner who'd weighed a costly detour sat in a ministry room while foreign consultants presented an ocean opportunities slide. A shaded block glowed over deep water beyond 200 miles. Potential extended shelf, they said. She recognized the grain of the map, the same private swath she'd seen under NDA. When the minister asked if filing would anger neighbors, the consultant smiled. The science supports you. Tui wondered whose science and who else had it. Meanwhile, across town, a telecom lobbyist argued that detailed seabed maps should be exempt from disclosure for critical infrastructure security. Activists countered that secrecy hides environmental damage and invites sabotage because no one can vet routes. Both were right. May sent a quiet note, redact exact lines, share hazard layers. It was a compromise that pleased nobody and kept the lights on. But there was one problem. Claims on rock are sticky, climate is not. Storms shift sands, landslides reshape margins, ice retreats and advances, changing the acoustic rules that submarines depend on and the geomorphic evidence that lawyers cite. A foot of slope picked in 2025 might move by 2035. The law pretends permanence, the seafloor keeps breathing. Certainty ages, then hardens into policy anyway. Get this, while states argue rights over polymetallic nodules, tech companies run their own empire. Private cables landing in friendly jurisdictions, bypassing others, mapping benches they never publish. Their lines on water become de facto borders of data. When one country is cut out of a landing, its leverage fades. When another hosts multiple landings, it becomes a hub with political gravity. The bathymetry that made routes safe becomes leverage that makes policies bend. Micro-story, a small island parliament debated a foreign-funded marine survey for climate resilience. Elena sat in back. The fine print allowed incidental acquisition of seabed profile data. An opposition member asked if that meant bathymetry. The sponsor said, yes, but for safety. Elena raised her hand after and said, share the hazard maps with your neighbors. The minister nodded, then signed the NDA anyway. The pier was already half built. In the aftermath of the Red Sea blackout, Red Sea littorals floated joint patrols and data trusts. The draft memo spoke of transparency and shared safety corridors. The annex, circulated only to a handful, listed corridors by coordinates with 6 decimals and warned, do not disseminate. Lines on water, claims on rock. The ocean remains a negotiation conducted in millimeters, argued in courtrooms, and felt when screens go dark. The ocean is wired, hydrophones and ghost roads. The first thing to know about the wired ocean is that it listens more than it talks. Long before fiber lit up continents, navies stretched ears across seabeds, strings of hydrophones pinned to anchors and cabled to shore. SOSUS in the Atlantic, cousins in the Pacific. Not microphones in the air sense, pressure sensors tuned to the ocean's gossip. Propellers far away, storms booming, whales negotiating their lives. Lines on the bottom became lines of hearing on a map nobody saw. Here's where it gets interesting. Those ears don't just hear, they shape how submarines move. A captain looks at a chart and sees more than depth. He sees ghost roads, routes where the hydrophone arrays fall silent, where seafloor shape and temperature layers bend sound away like light around a corner. The ghost roads aren't printed. They're taught, memorized, kept in safe binders on restricted shelves. They're the negative of the wired ocean, places not heard. And that's the psychological hook for every patrol. Trust the quiet you can't see, or doubt it and live longer. Micro-story, Pat, the former frigate sonar officer, visited an old array site in Scotland after he retired. A concrete bunker, damp and humming with dehumidifiers, sat above a trench where cables once ran. On a wall, a faded training poster showed a stylized slice of ocean with a thermocline curving like a smile. "Transit here," an arrow hinted. He traced the curve with his finger and realized it wasn't just physics. It was cartography without ink. He felt that old edge-of-seat vigilance return, the kind that keeps people alive when maps go vague. While something else was happening beneath the brand labels, hydroacoustic research programs blossomed in universities with innocuous names. They studied ambient noise and ocean soundscapes. The datasets built baselines of seasonal change, ship traffic fingerprints, and the way volcanic slopes scatter sound into confetti. Those baselines, when overlaid with bathymetry, revealed blind alleys and echo canyons. Civilian science turned the wired ocean's background into a guidebook for where not to be heard. Get this, hydrophone lines don't have to be continuous anymore. Drifting buoys drop temporary ears, seabed gliders park for weeks and wake on cue, autonomous nodes sync clocks with coded chirps and triangulate. Add AI that fuses these whispers with satellite hints, and you get acoustic heat maps that breathe with storms and shipping cycles. That's where bathymetry matters most, not just where water is deep, but where ridges cast acoustic shadows like city blocks at sunset. But there was one problem. The ghost roads are crowded. Submarines from rival fleets often learn the same gaps, hugging the same scarps where sound leaks upward instead of outward. Close calls happen where no one can admit they happened. A scrape on a hull gets written up as ice contact in warm water. A dent near a bow dome becomes a training anecdote told with the lights low. The road works until too many use it. Microstory, off the Kurils, a US boat once threaded a slot locals called the Needle. The pilot knew the temperature profile by season and the notch in the seafloor by meter. Halfway through, a faint metal rattle whispered through the hull, someone else's loose ladder. Both boats slowed without signaling. Both slid past without pinging. Later, an analyst on shore noticed a tiny rise in background noise on an array, a momentary smear. He circled it, wrote coincidence, and filed the log. Meanwhile, cable maps and hydrophone maps started to clash. Route engineers, desperate for quiet ground that resists trawlers, choose valleys with soft mud, exactly where hydrophones hear best. Military planners prefer hard-bottom benches that scatter sound, places route engineers avoid because anchors bite there. The secret maps layer like vellum sheets. One says safe to bury, another says safe to hide, another says safe to hear. When they overlap, the ocean becomes negotiation by coordinate. What nobody outside a few rooms knew at the time, repairs teach the arrays as much as patrols do. Every grapnel drop, every ROV thruster, every splice arc leaves a signature. Analysts learn what a repair convoy sounds like in a canyon versus on a shelf. In the Red Sea blackout's aftermath, a cluster of maintenance noises lined up with a burial pocket the public didn't know existed. The wired ocean heard the fix and inferred the cut. Here's the crazy part. Whales interfere. Their migration routes cross hydrophone lines, and their songs can mask low-frequency tones that arrays use to synchronize. Conservationists publish whale highways, militaries quietly shift array frequencies, submarines plan ghost roads that weave between seasons. Climate change nudges thermoclines deeper, rearranging the invisibility. A ghost road in June becomes a trap in October. The map isn't static, it's live. Microstory, Amina, the analyst from Perth, built a tool that watched long-term hydrophone noise floors against seasonal CTD casts. One year, the winter duct thickened in the East Indian Ocean and a known blind lane brightened. A month later, she saw fewer interesting transients downstream. Someone got the memo. Someone moved their road. Meanwhile, China's scientific, cabled observatories sprouted along shelves, measuring currents, chemistry, and quietly sound. Their cable-laying ship practiced bottom landings in depths that match known patrol arcs. Public papers touted microseisms and fish choruses. The arrays heard screws. The US Navy seeded mobile nodes in response, designed to lift and walk when discovered. Europe tested passive barriers. Project names changed. The logic didn't. Wire the ocean, then find the gaps in your own wiring. But there was one more problem: attribution. A hydrophone hears a cut, but can't point a finger with certainty. Anchor drag and sabotage can sound similar if done well. The wired ocean gives warnings, not verdicts. That's why the ghost roads endure, plausible deniability runs on sound as much as sight. In the aftermath of Cairo's blackout, Elena sat with a printout of a seabed profile, a thermocline curve, and a redacted hydrophone log, 3 maps for one event. She traced the ridge, the duct, the noise spike, and said out loud what Karim, May, Pat, Amina, and Tui all knew in their bones. The ocean is wired, but the wires obey the bottom. If you own the bottom's detail, you don't just hear. You decide who hears and who disappears. Drone cartographers, AUVs, and seafloor swarms. The quiet pivot from ships to swarms started with a budget line and a weather forecast. A week of storms once meant a week of blank pixels. Now, when the barometer drops, the mothership stays on the horizon while a flotilla of uncrewed surface vessels fans out and a pack of AUVs slips under the chop. The map doesn't stop, it multiplies. Here's where it gets interesting. An AUV 10 meters above the bottom can read sand ripples like fingerprints. It carries multi-beam, sub-bottom profilers, magnetometers, cameras when the water's clear enough, and a hard drive that never talks to the internet until it's back in human hands. A single mission draws a ribbon through the dark. A dozen AUVs, staggered and synchronized, turn a basin into a quilt overnight. The speed isn't the headline, the pattern is. Micro story: Rafi took a contract in the Coral Sea babysitting 3 yellow torpedoes with no names on their hulls. He watched on a dim screen as their inertial nav drifted, corrected by short acoustic pings from a USV that loitered like a shepherd. At dawn, one AUV surfaced a mile off schedule, blinking a strobe in a swell. Rafi hauled it aboard and pulled the drive. The first slice of data showed a scarp the public grids smeared into mush. A narrow bench appeared, flat, clean, a cable's dream. He smiled, then frowned at the second slice, faint magnetic wiggles along the bench edge. Old steel, a wreck no chart admitted. The detour would be small, the savings would be huge, the wreck would keep its secret. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the code. AI stopped being a buzzword and started driving the lawnmower. Onboard models learned to recognize features in the sonar feed, sand waves, tailless fans, fresh slump scars, and adjust track lines in real time. If the ridge turned out sharper than expected, the AUV tightened its grid and notified the shepherd. If backscatter screamed bedrock, it widened spacing to save battery and come back for a high-res pass with a second unit. The mosaic got smarter without a call to shore. Get this, the swarm doesn't need GPS below the surface. It builds its own sky from sound. USVs ping-coded chirps, AUVs triangulate, clocks sync to microseconds. A wrong clock makes a bent canyon, a right one makes a corridor. That's why the best teams still carry old rituals forward. Redundant clocks, independent casts, manual sanity checks where a human squints at a profile and says, "Does this feel like the bottom I know?" The swarm can draw. Humans still judge. But there was one problem. Silence is security and swarms like to talk. Every ping is a tell for anyone listening. Militaries solved it by flipping the model. For patrol corridors, AUVs go dumb, autonomous, preplanned, running dark with only emergency pings. They dump data into hardened recorders, surface on schedule undercover, and beam nothing. Commercial teams compromise with burst transmissions and narrow beams. Everyone encrypts. Everyone carries spare drives because trust in radio ends at the waterline. Micro story: May's company rented time on a European USV platform in the North Atlantic. The contract forbade continuous comms near certain coordinates. Her swarm ran dark for 18 hours, surfaced a handoff, then dove again. Back in the lab, she stitched the ribbons and found a tiny slump scar transecting a planned route, 2 meters high, fresh, invisible on last year's pass. She wrote one line: "Shift east by 150 m." The client balked at the delay. 3 months later, a winter's storm hit. The scar grew into a gash that would have stripped the sheath. May printed the before-after and taped it above her desk, next to the coral knuckle. Meanwhile, China fielded its own shepherds. Unbranded catamarans traced rectangles off contested shelves, while deep AUVs logged quietly. Academic papers showed high-resolution maps of ecosystem features. The figures cropped just shy of cable corridors and known patrol entries. In the South China Sea, a new class of data buoys sprouted, relaying oceanographic measurements. They also heard pings. Across the way, allied navies ran counter-swarms. Deca USVs broadcasting plausible survey patterns while the real work happened 2 ridges over. The cartography became misdirection as much as measurement. What nobody outside a small circle knew at the time, swarms also redraw the under-ice playbook. Under Arctic leads, AUVs follow acoustic breadcrumbs dropped by ice-tethered beacons, mapping ridges and keel scours that never see sunlight. A single season can transform a submarine's under-ice atlas from lore to lane lines. The same craft, redeployed in the CCZ, paint nodule fields with a resolution regulators can't ignore and miners won't share. Elena watched a presentation where a heat map of benthic habitat looked suspiciously like a claim map. She asked for the raw swathes. The presenter smiled and said, "Partnership pending." Here's the crazy part. Repair barges now tow small AUVs ahead of grapnels to preview the bottom in real time. Karim's cousin sent him a clip, the AUV's sonar feed gliding over a burial pocket, then a sudden cliff where an earthquake had chewed the trench. The barge adjusted, the grapnel dropped, the splice succeeded on the first try. What used to take days took one tide. Precision saved time, time saved risk. But there was one more problem. Sucking the ocean into drives creates footprints on land. Customs officials ask why a crate is data, 12 TB, encrypted. Port agents make copies they shouldn't. A lost case on a dock becomes an intelligence windfall. Raffi watched a pelican case roll across a deck in rough seas and felt his stomach drop harder than the boat. The case was latched. The secret map stayed secret, this time. In the aftermath of the Red Sea blackout, consortia quietly booked more swarm time. Not because they trusted people less, because they trusted time less. The ocean moves. The only answer is to move faster. AUVs and USVs don't make the map less secret, they make it denser. The swarm draws the world that the cables need, the submarines navigate, the miners covet, and the rest of us can't see unless the lights go out and the absence of a map becomes the loudest sound in the room. When the bottom moves, the secret map pretends the ocean is furniture, fixed, reliable, but the floor moves, not every century, sometimes every season. A ledge slumps by centimeters, a canyon head chews forward, sand waves march, faults shrug. Certainty decays while contracts assume it doesn't. Get this, gravity currents are the ocean's avalanches. A storm or quake shakes a shelf, mud liquefies, and a turbidity flow runs for hours at highway speeds, snapping anything in its path. In 1929, the Grand Banks slide time-stamped cable breaks as the mud wave raced downhill. That was telegraph wire. Today it's fiber carrying markets. The physics didn't retire when copper did. Microstory, May opened a file labeled Routine Inspection, Biscay Shelf. The multi-beam swath showed last year's sand waves, neat as corduroy. This year the crest had shifted 40 meters and steepened. Her route, threaded between waves, was now riding a crest like a tightrope. She didn't call a meeting. She drew a red line, sent a one-sentence note, shift corridor south by 180 m, and booked a drone to rerun the patch. The drone found a fresh slump at the old crossing, 2 meters high, invisible on the public grid. Small move, big save. Meanwhile, something else was happening deeper. Submarine canyons migrate. Their heads retreat upslope, eating shelves grain by grain. Each bite changes how sound behaves. A ghost road can brighten after a winter of storms because a wall got sharper, turning a soft scatter into a mirror. A skipper who learned the lane 5 years ago might find it ringing today. That's not bad luck. That's geomorphology. Microstory, Pat visited his old frigate. The new sonar officer showed him a blank wedge where a beloved blind lane used to be. They pulled archival profiles. The canyon wall had sharpened by a degree. 1 degree sounds trivial until your sound ray bounces instead of slipping past. Pat whistled, then wrote the only lesson that survived his career: never trust last year's silence. Earthquakes write edits nobody negotiates. In 2023, a mid-plate jolt in a quiet basin lifted a bench by centimeters. Not news, but for one patrol approach, that bench had been the clearance margin. AUV remaps picked up the lift, a route shifted by a mile. No press, just a courier with a drive and a skipper who slept easier. Yet this, climate change doesn't just warm the air, it warms the water column, deepening thermoclines and bending sound differently. A duct that used to hide a boat in spring might only form in late summer now. The secret map has layers, bathymetry below, temperature above. Both move. Amina's tool, the one that watched hydrophone floors, flagged a new seasonal pattern. A blind lane in the East Indian Ocean shrank by 10 kilometers as the duct sagged. A month later, transient counts dropped downstream. Somebody got the update, somebody lived by it. But there was one problem. Seafloor mining wants to turn static claims into moving machines. In the CCZ, prototype collectors trundle across nodules, stirring plumes that creep downslope. Plumes don't just affect biology, they settle into hollows, smoothing microrelief that cable planners and submarines both use. A bench can lose its texture. A soft patch can harden. The map gains asterisks no public EIS includes. Microstory, Elena sat in a windowless room while a mining consortium briefed regulators. They showed habitat maps, careful and colorful. She asked about plume deposition on slopes. The engineer smiled, minimal at scale. Weeks later, a partner leaked a private swath, same slope after a test. Backscatter had dulled over 100 meters, as if someone had dusted the floor. Elena didn't accuse. She wrote a note that will outlive the slide deck. Moving bottom, moving rules. Meanwhile, cables age in moving frames. Burial depths shrink as sands scour. An anchor furrow from last year becomes a trench that captures next year's trawl board. Karim's cousin sent a photo of a grapnel groove that had become a channel. The repair crew adjusted burial, then cut a small riprap of sandbags upstream, a speed bump for mud. It looked improvised. It was strategy. Here's the crazy part. The maintenance economy teaches humility. Swarms return to the same corridor and find small betrayals. A new scar, a tilted boulder, a fresh collapse after a distant quake. Raffi once overlaid 3 years of canyon slices and watched the wall breathe. He drew arrows like a coach mapping a play. He wasn't dramatizing, he was admitting the map is a movie, not a poster. But there was one more problem. Law lags motion. Legal foot of slope, picks can ossify into boundaries while the slope retreats. An EEZ claim leans on a contour that wandered. A mining block approved on a stable, plain, sprouted dunes. The bottom moves, the paperwork doesn't. In the aftermath of the Red Sea blackout, an uncomfortable truth settled over the rooms that trade in certainty. Someone had a sharper, newer picture of a bottom that refuses to stay still. The answer wasn't just better locks on data. It was faster refresh, broader sharing of hazard layers, and a cultural shift. Treat the seafloor like weather, forecasted, watched, and respected for its right to change its mind. Mining the abyss, maps for a new gold rush. New rush didn't begin with shovels. It began with heat maps, patches of the Clarion-Clipperton zone glowing like embers on private screens. Nickel, cobalt, manganese, rare earths, the metals inside batteries and turbines sitting in nodules spread across 1 million square miles. On the public grid, the CCZ looks like a speckled plane. On the secret mosaic, it's a catalog, nodule size distributions, sediment thickness, microtopography telling machines where to bite and where to break. Get this, mining a nodule field is vacuum and go. Collectors ride sleds over a bottom that's more lunar dust than beach sand. A wrong tilt, and the sled plows, digs, stalls. So companies pay for centimeter truth, multi-beam for shape, backscatter for hardness, sub-bottom profiles for how much mud hides beneath the nodules. They stitch in AUV magnetometer lines to dodge WWAI wrecks and their still active ordnance. They feed it all into path planning software that plots a harvest like a farmer hedging rain. The map is the business. Microstory, an engineer named Rosa sat in a dim trailer aboard a contractor ship west of Mexico, watching a collector's test run stutter. The sled began to chatter, tiny oscillations hinting at pebbles beneath powder. She flipped to the backscatter layer and saw a dull smear the sail's deck had called homogeneous. It was. She keyed a new path upslope to a subtly brighter stripe, coarser grain, better traction. The sled settled, nodded, and flowed forward. Her boss exhaled. Later, Rosa pulled the original exploration map from the pitch. It had no texture. Someone had made a choice about what the public saw. Meanwhile, something else was happening above the sleds. Regulators at the International Seabed Authority asked for environmental baselines, species, sediments, currents, noise. Companies delivered models wrapped in science language and NDAs. Independent scientists asked for raw bathymetry to assess plume fate and habitat vulnerability. The answer was proprietary, paired with glossy summaries. The loop repeated, "Trust us, we've mapped enough." Elena sat in the back of those meetings, hearing echoes of cables, patrols, and claims. The stakes had changed. the playbook hadn't. What nobody outside a few teams knew at the time, plume behavior lives in the fine grain. A collector lifts sediment into the water, some falls fast, some drifts for kilometers faint as smoke. Where it settles depends on microrelief, the same ridges and hollows the mining path depends on. Smooth a hollow with repeated passes and you change the plume's landing spot. Backscatter dulls, habitat shifts. The secret map doesn't just route a machine. It engineers an ecosystem's future in centimeters. Microstory, a biologist named Hana lowered a camera lander into a control patch. A mining pre-feasibility study had labeled benign. The feed showed a small octopus tucked against a pebble in a shallow depression. 3 months later, after a collector trial upslope, she returned. The depression had filled with fine silt. The pebble vanished under dust. The octopus was gone. Hana took the coordinates to a meeting. The mining rep nodded and said, "Local variability." She wrote 2 words in her notebook, "Mapped outcome." Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Investors want schedules, schedules want corridors, corridors want certainty. So they hire the same survey firms that map cables and patrol boxes, and they get the same product: millimeter swathes, AUV tapes, drives that move by hand. In one tender, a bidder quietly included an operational bathymetry update plan, remapping harvest lanes every 6 months to catch slumps, dune migration, and collector-made changes. It read like humility. It was also defense against litigation. If you refresh the map, you claim due care. If you don't, you own the drift. Meanwhile, rival states watch with their own maps. China's drilling ships in scientific missions produce high-resolution swathes of CCZ tracks adjacent to their contracts and beyond. Western firms do the same, swapping data through subsidiaries. Officially, everyone respects ISA boundaries. Practically, bathymetry bleeds across lines like ink in water. A future dispute over who mined too close to whom will hinge on whose centimeter map a judge believes. Data becomes witness. Get this, tech giants with battery supply problems aren't waiting for minerals to reach port. They fund responsible sourcing pilots and quietly send auditors who are actually route engineers, checking whether collector paths match hazard layers. The auditors don't need species counts. They need slope angles, sediment shear strengths, and where microgullies funnel plumes into neighbors' blocks. Transparency, on the slide, becomes access to swathes in the contract. But there was one problem. The CCZ isn't the only prize. Arctic shelf edges hide gas hydrates, combustible ice, and metal-rich crusts cling to seamount flanks. Those flanks are also sanctuaries and ghost roads. A collector that doesn't just scrape metal, it scrapes tactics. A path that roughens a bench can brighten a hydrophone line. A plume that settles in a channel can dampen a cable's burial pocket. The mining map touches the military map. Both pretend the other is irrelevant. Microstory, TUI, now advising her government, read an offer, a climate resilience survey that included optional resource assessment. She asked for the exact deliverables. The vendor promised hazard maps for cables and nodules, distribution for economic planning. She asked who else would see the data. The vendor said, partners. She wrote a condition, hazard layers public, extraction layers escrowed, timed release. The room went quiet. The pier outside glinted in sun paid for by the same partners. Meanwhile, activists push for moratoriums, insisting the deep sea is too unknown, too fragile. They aren't wrong. But the corporate counter-argument lands hard. Demand for minerals is real, terrestrial mines are messy, the ocean holds alternatives. Between them sits the map, a chooser of harms. Share enough to prevent accidents, hide enough to protect assets, refresh fast because the bottom moves, slow down because life grows on decades. Everyone asks for certainty. The abyss offers degrees of confidence. In the aftermath of the Red Sea blackout, one CCZ consortium slipped a clause into a supplier contract. Emergency reroute capability, seafloor hazards, or geopolitical events. That meant swarm on call, drives on couriers, path planners trained to dodge not just boulders but bands. The new gold rush isn't only about metal. It's about who controls the centimeter truth that turns metal into money without turning the ocean into silence. Allies, friction, and the data trap. Alliances love speeches and hate decimals. On paper, partners share. In practice, bathymetry turns friends into careful accountants. What you give, what you keep, and what you blur just enough that nobody gets hurt if it leaks. After the blackout, the first priority was obvious: stitch a safer picture together. The second priority was unspoken: Don't give away your home waters. Get this: inside a NATO lab in Norfolk, a joint working group opened drives like gift boxes. US corridors in the Atlantic, British slices near shelves, French swathes in canyon country. The screen lit up with gray relief and black gaps. The gaps weren't accidents, they were policy. Originating nation retains tactical fidelity, the memo said. Engineers translated, downsampled here, masked there, metadata clipped. Enough to route a cable around a scarp. Not enough to teach a rival how your submarines vanish. Microstory: a Canadian analyst named Noor loaded a partner file and saw the hallmarks of a patch test: crisp edges, perfect beam alignment, then a sudden fuzz where the slope steepened. She pinged her counterpart, who typed, "Instrument limits." Noor smiled. It wasn't limits, it was limits on trust. She adjusted her model anyway and wrote, "Thanks." The reply came back fast, "Stay safe." Meanwhile, something else was happening across the Pacific. The Quad, US, Japan, India, Australia stood up a resilient seabed task force. Publicly, it meant cable redundancy. Privately, it meant pooling hazard layers for choke points and swapping swarm time when weather pinned one partner down. The swap came with strings: no onward sharing, no mention in Parliament, no crossing certain latitudes. The map looked cooperative and read like a prenup. Here's where the trap tightens. The more partners share, the more they risk creating dependencies they can't unwind. A patrol route that leans on allied swathes can't be executed if a government changes and pulls the plug. A cable corridor that threads a bench discovered by a partner requires permission to refresh forever. The data trap isn't just "we need more," it's "we can't move without what you own." Microstory: Tui sat on a video call with 2 flags on the screen and a contract on her desk. Her island needed a second cable. Donors offered maps in exchange for cooperative security measures. She asked what that meant. Joint patrols, notification of surveys, a diplomat said. The engineer on the call added, gently, and a commitment not to share high-resolution bathymetry with third parties. Tui looked at the pier, built with someone else's money, and felt the trap close with a click. Get this: commercial partners complicate alliances. A tech giant funds a route survey, then offers a safety layer to governments, redactions included. Oil majors swap multi-beam tiles with navies under deconfliction MOUs. A university gets a grant to characterize shelf hazards, then receives a quiet request to withhold raw swathes from open repositories. Elena watched a consortium propose a data trust that sounded like transparency and functioned like a vault. The governance board had 3 seats for states, 2 for companies, 1 for civil society. She asked who held the keys. Silence. But there was one problem: friction leaks. A downsampled tile that hides a bench also hides a hazard. A masked backscatter layer that protects a patrol bench can send a cable over hard ground. After the Red Sea, insurers insisted on verifiable hazard provenance. That meant citations for the pixels themselves, who mapped when with what gear. Partners balked. The compromise was ugly: signatures from auditors who could see the raw files, sign NDAs, and say sufficient. Everyone pretended that word meant safe. Microstory: May flew to Wellington to audit a partner corridor. She sat in a locked room, scrolled through raw pings, checked patch tests, and initialed a line that said, "No known microslumps intersect planned route." On the way out, an officer asked her, "Could we get a slice near your strait?" She shook her head. Later, back home, she pushed a software update that added a new mask routine: automated downsampling at sovereign boundaries. Efficiency or ethics? Both, she told herself. It still felt like sanding off a fingerprint. Meanwhile, militaries chase common pictures of acoustic risk. AI fusion nodes ingest allied thermoclines, local CTD casts, and borrowed bathymetry to forecast ghost roads by day. The forecast runs are only as good as the shakiest input. A censored slope in one partner's yard turns a predicted safe duct into a ringing alley. A skipper gets handed a colored lane and a caveat: confidence medium. He hears what that really means. We're guessing for you because someone guessed for us. What nobody says into the microphone at joint pressers: allies sometimes shadow each other's surveys. Quiet USVs loiter one ridge over, painting their own copy of shared corridors at full fidelity. The justification is simple: redundancy. The message is not trust, but verify. In the aftermath of the blackout, Elena drafted a proposal: public hazard layers with exact hazards fuzzed to zones, rapid refresh packs, escrowed centimeter maps released under agreed triggers, repair disaster investigation. States argued scope, companies argued cost, admirals argued risk. The data trap didn't spring open. It loosened a notch. Sometimes that's all an alliance gets. Enough slack to keep moving, enough friction to remember where the edges are. The day the map lied. It started as a routine window between squalls, 40 hours of decent seas on the Luzon Strait's eastern shelf. May's team had greenlit a repair assist, preview the corridor with an AUV so a barge could drop, grab and splice before the weather folded back in. The corridor was familiar, sharpened last quarter, flown by 2 swarms since. The file name sounded confident, LS Entry Bench V7 Final. Everyone joked about the second final. Nobody changed it. Karim's cousin sent a note from Kaohsiung. We'll be on station at dawn. Send the ribbon. Rafi, now consulting, checked the pre-mission casts, nodded at the thermocline curve and signed off. Amina's forecast tool shaded the ghost road medium-low risk. Pat, invited as a courtesy, shrugged at the slope, the kind he'd have trusted on a patrol. Elena watched from a conference room, the Red Sea memo still in her bag, and said, if it looks good, share the hazard zone with the island's side. May promised to try. The first pass looked fine, depths matching last month within decimeters, backscatter textures as expected. Then the second pass came back with a seam, not a software seam, a subtle tilt, as if the bench had rotated along an axis nobody drew. 5 meters of relief bled into the corridor where the model said 2. Rafi asked for a sanity cast. The CTD told the same story. Sound speed hadn't changed enough to warp a cliff. The cliff had moved. Micro story. On the AUV's camera, the bottom flickered through silt. A cable scar crossed the frame like a pale line. 10 meters later, the scar vanished under a fresh slough, new sediment, fine as flour, draped over the track the route counted on. The AUV's altimeter ticked up and down as if it were breathing. The pilot muttered, that wasn't there. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the water above. A minor quake 2 weeks earlier, barely noticed on land, had nibbled at a canyon head-up slope. Nothing dramatic, enough to set a thin wedge of mud creeping. It reached the bench, paused like a cat at a ledge, then slid in a slow, silent sheet. The public grid would never see it. The last month's swath hadn't either. The final swore the shelf was flat, where it now rose and fell like a lazy wave. Karim's cousin radioed, we're on station, proceed. May stared at the seam and said, hold. Insurance hated that word. The barge burned money by the hour. The client pinged, weather window. Pat tapped the screen and said gently, you don't get to be wrong here. Amina ran her model with the new profile. The ghost road brightened on one edge, dimmed on the other. Elena texted the island regulator, potential hazard shift, advised delaying traffic alert. The reply was immediate, we already announced. Can we retract? May felt the trap, tell the truth and admit you don't know, stay quiet and risk a cut. The third pass erased doubt. The bench's safe lane had narrowed by half. A fresh microscar ran like a wrinkle along the corridor's heart. Backscatter dulled in a ribbon where fine silt had settled, traction for a collector someday, treachery for a grapnel today. May keyed 2 words to the barge, abort drop. On deck, Karim's cousin cursed, then looked at the sky and said thanks under his breath. He'd seen what a lazy sheet of mud can do to a rope. Micro story, Rafi pulled last quarter's swath and overlaid it on the new. The difference map looked like veins under skin, thin, branching, deceptive. He circled a notch and wrote, knife edge now. The notch sat exactly where the final encouraged a slight jog to save time. Efficiency had aged into risk. What nobody had considered in the rush was how the seismic wiggle intersected with human timing. A fishing fleet had dragged heavy gear across the bench 2 days earlier, trying to beat the storm. Their furrows gave the creeping silt rails to follow. Nature nudged, people guided. The map didn't lie out of malice. It lied because it was yesterday. Meanwhile, politics tightened. The client pushed back. The corridor was certified. May replied, it isn't now. Insurers demanded provenance for the new pixels, who collected when with what gear. The barge captain asked if he could just try the old pocket. Pat told him about a scar he'd logged as ice contact. The captain waited. Amina flagged the thermocline sagging by a meter in the hour since the first pass. Sound would bend differently by night. The AUV's shepherd pinged the swarm to tighten spacing. Battery clocks ticked down. Elena drafted a notice, temporary hazard, depth anomaly, coordinates redacted to protect infrastructure. She hated the sentence and sent it anyway. Get this, by midnight, the seam had crept farther. A fourth pass captured a tiny slump on the notch's lip. A fifth showed a ripple settling, as if the bench were exhaling. May redrew the corridor east by 220 meters, then south by 90 around the wrinkle. The barge plotted the new drop. The splice went clean at dawn. No headlines, no wobble in currencies, just a stale final renamed with a date and a quiet memo. Map invalidated by microfailure, refresh cadence inadequate. But in the aftermath, the lesson wasn't dramatic. It was tedious and expensive. The team added a rule: any corridor near an active canyon head gets a same-week swath before a repair, not a same month. Insurers added a clause: seismic thresholds trigger mandatory resurvey. Regulators asked if hazard zones could be public without giving away benches. May proposed a compromise: share the change maps, not the maps. Elena pushed for it. Pat nodded. The day the map lied didn't end with blame. It ended with a slow shift in habit, less faith in final, more budget for refresh, fewer jokes about file names, more ugly honesty in emails. The ocean hadn't betrayed them. It reminded them of the only rule that matters at the bottom: trust the last pass and make sure it's truly the last. The push for an honest ocean. The fix after the lie wasn't a headline, it was a posture. Elena called it honest ocean, not open secrets, not performative transparency, but a baseline that keeps ships safe, cables alive, submarines cautious, and ecosystems seen. It started small: share change, not centimeter truth. Publish where the bottom moved, keep patrol benches masked. It felt like splitting hairs. It worked better than silence. Get this, hazard deltas became the new currency. Instead of raw swathes, teams posted where it changed tiles: red for uplift, blue for slump, gray for stable. No coordinates past 2 decimals, no textures that betray hard bottom hiding spots. Insurers accepted them, regulators used them, and repair barges got just enough warning to ask for fresh ribbons before they dropped steel. Micro-story: TUI pushed a bill through Parliament. Any survey done with public money must release hazard deltas within 30 days. Industry howled, Navy's sighed. She carved an exemption for sovereign defense and a sunset clause that forced review. 6 months later, a trawler captain avoided a fresh scar flagged in red, and the harbor master sent TUI a photo of his intact gear. The exemption stayed. The deltas stayed too. Meanwhile, something else took shape: a cadence pact. May sketched it on a napkin: risky corridors refreshed quarterly, canyon edges monthly in storm season, choke points before any announced maintenance. Companies balked at cost, then remembered the Red Sea invoice. They agreed, so long as refresh rights could be swapped across partners when weather boxed them in. A dance, but a predictable one. Amina built the public side of honesty, a duct watch that posted seasonal acoustic forecasts without revealing centimeter maps. Color bands hinted where ghost roads would shrink or bright spots would ring guidance, not gospel. Sonar techs grumbled, skippers rolled eyes, activists applauded a rare nod to sound. But there was one problem: color invites courage. Elena added a disclaimer in blunt type: forecasts are not permissions. Pat took the idea to old colleagues. He told the ice contact story and asked for a quiet concession: after-action debriefs when the ocean surprises you, not the classified guts, just the physics. A shelf lifted, a duct sagged, a canyon sharpened. Lessons that save crews without naming boats. The first memo came from a Navy that rarely writes memos: 3 sentences, enough. Micro-story: Rafi started running last-pass councils before big repairs, engineer, captain, analyst, regulator on one call. No slides, just the newest swath and 2 questions: what changed? What if we're wrong? On the night a storm shaved their window to hours, that habit bought them minutes they needed. Later, he wrote the only KPI that mattered: no surprises inflicted. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Honesty means admitting who holds the sharpest pixels. Tech giants, oil majors, and states hoard different corners. The honest ocean forced escrow, centimeter truth sealed with a trustee, released only for repair, disaster, or investigation. Companies resisted until insurers priced in secrecy. Navies bristled until they wrote their own keys. It wasn't elegant, it was possible. Meanwhile, claims and mining pressed in. Liv's Arctic Ridge, Rosa's sled, Hana's octopus. Science needed enough map to challenge minimal impact. So Elena brokered an exchange: environmental tiles for hazard deltas. If you scrape a slope, you publish Plumes settling zones at coarse scale. If you run a safety survey, you publish where the bottom breathed. Activists called it weak. Operators called it risky. Fishers called it useful. What nobody expected, honesty sharpened deterrence. When states published deltas at choke points, it quietly told saboteurs, "We are watching motion." When consortia posted duct watches, it told commanders, "Assume the other side read this too." The game stayed grey, the board got clearer. But there was one more problem. Trust leaks at the edges, ports, couriers, contractors. So the push added boring locks, tamper-evident drives, sign-and-seal chains, on-ship audits where a second set of eyes checks patch tests and time syncs, nor wrote a guide so dry it might prevent a war. The honest ocean wasn't a revelation, it was a ritual. In the aftermath, Elena stood on a pier with Tui, May, Amina, Pat and Rafi on a screen. They hadn't fixed secrecy, they de-fenced it. They hadn't published the map. They de-admitted the floor moves and that people move faster when they admit it. The ocean didn't become transparent. It became accountable enough that fewer lies slipped through labeled final. What the map demands. The map you can't see still rules, but it now carries a mirror, change tiles, duct watches and the habit of asking, what if we're wrong? That's what the bottom demands. Humility on schedule. If this mattered, subscribe. If you want the sequel, the Arctic lanes, the mining standoffs, the ghost roads shifting with heat, watch the next story now and share this with someone who still thinks the ocean sits still.